I would like to say from my part, I'm greatly honored by the invitation, which I accepted with great pleasure. So what I would like to do with you today and in the following three lectures. So in general, I would like to proceed always in the same way. So I will lecture on some aspect of Thomas Aquinas' interpretation of the doctrine of divine simplicity for roughly 45, 50 minutes. And then we will conclude our session with roughly 30 minutes of Q&A where we can discuss. So please make yourself notes on any questions or objections which might occur to you during my presentation. And then we will deal with them at the end of my talk. I think that's better than interrupting in between. So first of all, I would like to give you a brief overview of the four lectures. What's my aim with these four lectures? What I would like to convey to you, what I would like to introduce to. So it's called the Lectures on Divine Simplicity. So that will be my focus on all these four lectures, and they are structured in the following way. So today I would like to think with you about the question, why should I care? I mean, the whole purpose of the Ignatian Scholar Corps is to um, make you aware of the rich intellectual resources that the Jewish, Christian, the Catholic tradition has, and to say these resources are very helpful for many pressing contemporary issues. So if that's the case, so why exactly focus on something which at first hand seems to be very strange, a very strange doctrine, or something which sounds very technical or only for advanced people? So why really speak about that kind of topic? So that's the focus of today. So why should we care to learn something about the doctrine of divine simplicity? So the second lecture tomorrow is I would like to speak to you about what divine simplicity is not. And especially always in these lectures, I want to focus on the thought of Thomas Aquinas and show to you that he's one important figure from which we can learn a lot. And especially we can also learn, if we look at the writings of Aquinas, we can learn something very important about what divine simplicity is not and why it is important to correct certain mistakes which you can find in the literature about the doctrine of divine simplicity. That will be the second lecture. So, and then the third lecture will be, there you can see that we can learn something very important from the doctrine of divine simplicity, namely, it explains us something very important about God's nature, God's essence, how he is, how God is in himself. And we will look a little bit at some of Aquinas' writings on Dionysius, how he explains that we can know something about a God which in principle is incomprehensible. Isn't that a contradiction or something like that? How is that possible? And then in the fourth lecture, I would like to reconnect. We are going full circle a little bit back on the topic of today's talk, why we should care about the doctrine of divine simplicity. And I will argue that we should care because it tells us something very important about human flourishing. And I think everyone is interested in human flourishing. Everyone wants to be happy. So, and I will come around in the fourth and final lecture, full turn to this question, with which I will begin now. So first lecture on divine simplicity, why should we care? So why should we care about the doctrine of Divine Simplicity and especially of Aquinas' interpretation of it. So a first preliminary answer could be that the doctrine of divine simplicity, well, it is, as a matter of fact, part of the intellectual heritage of the Christian tradition. Thus, anyone who is interested in handing over the wisdom contained in this tradition, and anyone who believes that the acquisition of this wisdom is necessary to transform the societies and the world we live in such a way that human beings can fully flourish in them, well, we should care about the doctrine. But this answer is, well, it's a good answer, but it's still unsatisfactory because it leaves unexplained what really the connection is between the doctrine and human flourishing. Well, you might be, isn't it more important to speak about divine goodness or, well, directly look at the Bible or at Jesus or something like that? So what is really the connection between the doctrine and human flourishing? Well, look at it this way. Um, One could object that given our limitations in time and resources, other aspects of the Christian tradition are more important, especially with respect to the relevance for human flourishing. So instead of dealing with rather difficult to understand characterizations of the divine nature, like the one given by the doctrine of divine simplicity, it seems at least at the first look, it seems far more relevant to deal with more down-to-earth aspects of the Christian tradition, like, for example, what the Christian tradition has to tell us on ethics or social issues. One could say, is a Christian perspective on ethical, social, or political issues not the most important thing the Christian tradition can contribute to the joint effort of all human beings of goodwill to transform society and the world in such a way that human beings can flourish in them? Isn't that the most important thing? And I would say yes and no. I would say, yeah, that's true. But in order to see what's the most important thing, what Christians can contribute to contemporary social and ethical issues, it's precisely to take a little detour and to begin really with the characterization of God, which the doctrine of divine simplicity gives us. So let's have a little bit at a little view at Thomas Aquinas and especially his views on human flourishing in order to see how an objection like the one I just spelled out motivated a little bit, why such an objection is flawed. And Thomas Aquinas, his views also help us to see why it is helpful to turn to the tradition itself. So let us have a look at the voluminous second part of his tripartite Summa Theologia, which is maybe the best known work of Thomas Aquinas. And you find that in its text 1 on the handout you have. So I read what Aquinas says there. He says, since, as Damascene states, human beings are said to be made in God's image, insofar as the image implies an intellectual being endowed with free will and self-movement. Now that we have treated of the exemplar, that means God, and of those things which came forth from the power of God in accordance with his will, it remains for us to treat of his image, that is, human beings, inasmuch as they too are the principle of their actions as having free will and control of their actions. So at the beginning of the immediately following first question, he says the following, text 2 in your handout. In this matter, we shall consider first the ultimate end of human life, and second, those things by means of which human beings may advance towards this end, or deviate from it. For from the end, one must take the reason or principles of those things which are ordered toward that end. And since the ultimate end of human life is happiness or flourishing, it is necessary first to consider the ultimate end in general and then to consider happiness or flourishing. So, an interesting point to notice here is that Aquinas' characterization of ethics is teleological in nature. That means it is goal orientated. The ultimate end of human life is flourishing, he states here. So, for him, ethics deals with those things by means of which human beings advance towards this end of flourishing or deviate from it. That means good and bad actions and their principles, like virtues or vices, for example. However, two things are important to note here. So first, the principles by means of which human beings advance towards their ultimate end, flourishing, derive from that end. What does that mean? Look at it this way. Whatever action guiding principles you have depend on what your ultimate end or conception of flourishing is. So, for example, if you believe that human flourishing consists in the accumulation of money or riches, you have a respective first principle. Those actions and character traits are good, which are conducive to the acquisition of money. And those actions or character traits are bad, which hinder the acquisition of money. Thus, it is of utmost importance to get things right with respect to what human happiness or flourishing consists in. One could say you become what you adore or what you are most eagerly striving for. You know, this is what St. Paul's tells us your God is a stomach, for example. You know, if you're looking always for pleasure and something like that, or something similar, you become a human being which is driven by the seeking of pleasures. And if you're driven by, if your God is riches or money, you become driven by that ultimate aim, and you become the person or you become an image of that what you adore. So a second point to notice is that on Aquinas' view, the ultimate end of human life is having communion with God or being in a loving relationship with God. So human flourishing consists in being with God, in friendship with God, being friends with God. However, since, as we have just seen in the text, Aquinas says, from the end, one must take the reasons or principles of those things which are ordered toward that end. It is, at least on Aquinas' view, necessary to be familiar with God. And it is therefore no accident that the second part of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae is prefaced by the first part, which deals with God. So if you look at the Summa Theologiae, it begins with God, the whole first part. And everything, it tells us how everything which is created is being ordered towards God, towards union with God. So look at it this way to understand why it is ordered in this way, the Summa, why it is structured in this way. In Aquinas' view, ethical principles derive from human nature. Since human beings are rational animals, ethics is closely related with human rationality. Human beings flourish insofar as they develop and exercise their rational capacities. That means their intellect and will. However, as Aquinas remarks, human beings are being created in the image of God. So human beings as creatures bear a certain similarity to God as their exemplar. Thus, on Aquinas' view, an adequate understanding of human nature and the ethical principles which derive from it requires an adequate understanding of the exemplar of human nature, namely God's nature. So Aquinas' ethics is an ethics of human beings insofar as they're rational creatures. So during these lectures, and especially in lecture 4, I will say more on the difference this makes for an adequate understanding of Christian ethics. For the moment, let us turn back on the question raised above. Why should we care to deal with the rather difficult to understand characterization of the divine nature given by the doctrine of divine simplicity? Well, the answer given by Aquinas as an authoritative figure of the Christian tradition is this. We should care because we care about happiness and flourishing. And in order to know how we can become happy and flourish, we need to know God. So that's a connection here which was missing at the beginning, that we say, why should we care about divine simplicity? Well, because in Aquinas' view, divine simplicity requires to be familiar with God, to know something about God and his principle, which the action guiding principles, the ethical norms and principle which lead us to flourishing and happiness, are rooted in human nature. And in order to understand human nature, because we are creatures made in the image of God, of God's nature, we need to understand something about God's nature. And something important about God's nature tells us the doctrine of divine simplicity. So that's the reasoning thus far, and a first preliminary answer to the objections I raised. But now we can say, we can raise a second objection, which one could say, well, is then human happiness or flourishing possible only for Christians? Is it something which is only relevant? Should I care about divine simplicity only if I'm a Christian? So think about it this way. So even if you're inclined to accept the argument thus far, you could, a second objection might form in your minds. And maybe in one of, or some of you who have listened to it, maybe it already had arisen, this objection. And it could be formulated in this way. If a Christian conception of ethics depends on knowledge of God, the Creator, and his essence or nature, does that mean that a Christian conception of ethics depends on revelation or faith? Well, if that were the case, Aquinas and the Christian tradition would have seemingly little to contribute to debates about human flourishing in a pluralistic or a secular context. That means in societies which encompass Christians, maybe of different denominations, and members of other religions, and atheists or agnostics. So, to see why the claim that a Christian conception of ethics depends on knowledge of God or the Creator and his essence or nature, that does not imply that a Christian conception of flourishing depends on revelation and faith, again, it is helpful to make use of some of the best resources that the Christian tradition provides. So at the very beginning of his Summa Theologia, in the first article of the first question, Aquinas is concerned with the question how theology and philosophy, or we could also say how faith and revelation and reason are related. And there he states, it's text 3 on your handout, I'll read it. I answer that it was necessary for a human being's flourishing that there should be a teaching revealed by God beyond the philosophical disciplines which are investigated by human reason. First, indeed, because human beings are directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of their reason. The eye hath not seen, O God, besides thee, what things thou hast prepared for them that love thee. But the end must first be known by human beings who are directed their thought, who are to direct their thoughts and actions to the end. Hence, it was necessary for the flourishing of human beings that certain truths which exceed human reasons should be made known to them by divine revelation. So a first thing to note about Aquinas' conceptions of revelation and reason and their relation is something interesting, namely that both have the same end. Namely, both are in service of human flourishing, which consists in knowledge of certain truths about God. And as I have explained at the beginning, in Aquinas' view, human flourishing consists in being in a loving union with God, which in turn requires knowledge of the object of love, because one cannot love what or whom one does not know. Consequently, knowledge of certain truths is necessary for human flourishing in Aquinas' view. Now, a second thing is important to note in that text which I just read, in that quote from Aquinas, namely that Aquinas distinguishes between two kinds of such revealed truth. First, there are certain truths about God which are revealed to humanity because God surpasses the grasp of human reasons. So these truths cannot be known by human reason alone, for the principal reason that their knowledge exceeds the capacities of human reason. So, for example, according to Aquinas and the Catholic tradition to which he adheres, a revealed truth about God which is beyond the grasp of human reason is that God exists as a trinity of persons which share one essence. However, secondly, there are truths about God which do not exceed human reason. That means truth about God which human beings can know by the exercise of their reasoning capacities, however, which are nevertheless revealed to humanity. Now, that's a case which seems to be puzzling at the first look. If human beings can know these truths, why are they revealed? So revelation in that case seems to be superfluous, or in the best case, and in the worst case, it seems to undermine the value or integrity of human reasoning. However, in Aquinas' view, the revelation of these truths, which can be known by human reason alone, solves an important problem, which brings us to text 4 you find on your handout. I read it. Even as regards those truths about God which can be discovered by human reason, it was necessary that humanity should be taught by divine revelation. Because the truth about God which reason can discover would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors. Whereas a human being's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of humanity might be brought about more fitly and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truth by divine revelation. Again, as I said, it is important to have in mind that revelation and human reason are in service of human flourishing. The problem with certain truths about God, which are in principle knowable by human reason alone, is that they're nevertheless not universally evident to every reasoning person. So the latter does not follow from the former because the reasoning process which might lead to the discovery of these truths is complex and prone to error. In other words, without revelation, knowledge of certain truths necessary for human flourishing would be a rather elitist affair, and it could happen that people make errors in reasoning and, in consequence, jeopardize their flourishing in virtue of having mistaken views about God. So thus, in conclusion, revelation is neither superfluous nor does it undermine the value or integrity of human reasoning. Rather, revelation comes to the aid of human reason. And we can now see why the second objection is flawed. So the distinction between two kinds of revealed truth makes room for the following possibility. It is true that a Christian conception of human flourishing depends on knowledge of God, of the Creator, and his knowledge of his essence and nature. However, it does not follow that human flourishing depends on revelation and faith. One can argue that the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the Creator and his essence or nature required for human knowledging, is accessible to human reasoning. And this brings us back full turn to the doctrine of divine simplicity. According to Aquinas, knowledge of the simplicity of divine nature is within the reach of human reason. In other words, in Aquinas' view, the doctrine of divine simplicity is part of so-called natural theology or philosophical theology, and not part of revealed theology. That means of theology in the strict sense, what we nowadays usually understand by the term theology. Let us have a look at some of the philosophical arguments which Aquinas presents in favor of the view that God is simple, philosophical arguments. So now we are looking at text 5, which is from chapter 18 of the first book of the Summa Contra Gentiles. So he presents there the following philosophical arguments for the existence of a God whose nature is simple. So Aquinas says, for in every composite thing there must be act and potency, since several things cannot become one simply, unless there be something actual there and something else potential. For those things that are in act are not united except as an assemblage or group, which are not one simply. And in these, the very parts that are gathered together are as a potency with respect to the union, for they are actually united after being potentially unitable. But in God there is no potency, therefore in him there is no composition. Again, every composite comes after its components. Therefore the first being, primum ens, which is God, has no component parts. Moreover, every composition requires a compounder, for if there is composition, it results from several things, and things that are several in themselves would not combine together unless they were united by a compounder. If then God were composite, he would have a compounder, for he could not compound himself, since no thing is in its own cause, for it would precede itself, which is impossible. Now the compounder is the efficient cause of the composite. Therefore, God would have an efficient cause, and thus he would not be the first cause, which was proved above. Further, every multitude is necessary before every multitude it is necessary to find unity. Now in every composite there is multitude. Therefore, that which is before all things, namely God, must be devoid of all composition. I want to highlight two things here. First, according to Aquinas, one can reason from created reality to the essence or nature of God. That is, one can gain knowledge of God's essence or nature via knowledge gained from created reality. So, for example, we can know by reason alone that there exists a multiplicity of created things. Look around you. Look at the things which surrounds you. And if you think about these things, you can also gain knowledge that everything is created, that everything you see by your senses, everything created is metaphysically composed, and that the explanation of these facts requires the existence of a God whose essence or nature is simple. So that's just, let's say, for him, there's nothing revealed necessary to gain such kind of knowledge. It's just philosophical knowledge we can gain by philosophical means. That's the first thing I want to underline. So a second thing which is important and which I will delve in more on the next lecture tomorrow. So we can see here that for Aquinas, the doctrine of divine simplicity, that God is not composed in any way, it is not a purely negative doctrine. It is not just simply saying us how God is not, if we look really at the text. Um, Rather, it teaches us three important positive things about God's essence or nature. So first, the doctrine tells us that God is pure actuality. That is, with the Latin term, he is esse, his existence, by his essence. The second thing which the doctrine teaches us in positive terms is that God is a being. So that God is ens, is an ens. So in the Latin term, we have esse, existence, and we have a being, yeah, something particular, which is an ens in Latin. So we have God is esse and he is a being, ens. Namely, and it gets more precise, he's the first being, the primum ens. That means he is the first uncaused cause of everything created. And third, God is by his essence, nature, esse and an ens. So he is being and a being. Otherwise, that we can learn from Aquinas' philosophical reasonings, if he wouldn't be esse and an ens, God would be metaphysically composed of esse and that which is. In Latin, id quod est. And then he would not be really simple. So, according to Aquinas, the doctrine of divine simplicity is central to the Christian worldview because it explains to us the fundamental difference between God and everything else existing. In God, his essence and esse are identical, while in everything else existing, there is a real distinction between its essence and its esse, its existence. And therefore, it is not surprising that Aquinas dedicates a whole chapter in his Summa contra Gentiles to argue for the conclusion that in God, essence and esse are the same. Let us have a brief look at three of his arguments. We are at text 6 of your handout. So Aquinas says, existence denotes a kind of act, since a thing is said to exist not through being in potency, but through being an act. Now, everything to which an act is becoming and which is distinct from that act is related thereto as potency to act. For act and potency are reciprocal terms. Accordingly, if the divine essence is distinct from its existence, it follows that its essence and existence are mutually related as potency and act. Now it has been proved that in God there is nothing of potency and that he is pure act. Therefore, God's essence is not distinct from his existence. All that can exist, all that cannot exist unless several things concur is composite. Now, no thing in which essence and existence are distinct from one another can exist unless several things occur, namely its essence and existence. Therefore, everything in which existence and essence and existence are distinct is composite. But God is not composite, as proved above. Therefore, God's existence is his essence. Last argument from Aquinas: everything exists through having existence. Therefore, nothing whose essence is not its existence exists by its essence, but by participation of something, namely existence. Now, that which exists by participation of something cannot be the first being, because that in which a thing participates in order to exist is prior to it. But God is the first being to whom nothing is prior. Therefore, God's essence is his existence. So far, Aquinas. Two things are important to note here. According to the first two arguments, the doctrine of divine simplicity tells us that God is by essence or nature pure actuality. That means esse, and that he therefore exists on virtue of what he is, namely pure existence. And the third argument establishes two things. First, everything in which essence and esse are not identical exists by participation in esse in order to exist and can therefore not be the first being, primum ens. That means the cause of the existence of things which are not esse by their essence. And that's basically what I wanted to tell you in this first lecture. So let's just briefly review what we have seen today. I've started with the question, why should we really care about the doctrine of divine simplicity? Why not, I don't know, dedicate our times and energy to understand other parts of the Christian tradition, what directly go to Christian ethics or social ethics or Catholic social teaching or other Christology or something like that. So, and I argued that in order to understand why and what's wrong with that kind of objection, uh, it's helpful to turn to Aquinas and how what he understands by ethics and for him ethics is always about human flourishing. So why should we care? On the first hand is, well, because everyone cares for well-being, for human flourishing. So that's not the question. And then the next step was to say, well, for Aquinas, human well-being and to know what kind of principles I have to choose, what character traits I have to acquire in order to flourish as a human being, that derives from human nature. So I have to understand human nature. But he says also, in order to understand human nature, I have to understand God's nature because we are created as images of God, of God's essence and nature. So, in order to understand human nature and get it right, what kind of principles I need to adopt in order to flourish as a human being, I need to understand God's nature. And there, the doctrine of divine simplicity plays an important part, as we will see in the following lectures, I think, with more detail. Well, the doctrine of divine simplicity is very central. Maybe the first step to begin to think about God and God's nature, because it tells us there is a fundamental difference between God and everything else which exists. And it tells us that in terms to say, well, God is existence itself, there is pure actuality, and everything which is created is somehow exists in a way which shows that in order to receive, to exist, it needs to receive something which it cannot give itself, namely existence. First cause is required, and that first cause can only be something, a being, which gives what it is itself, namely existence. And then we have seen that one could raise a second objection and say, well, if human flourishing depends on knowledge of God, because flourishing consists in knowing God and loving God, then an objection could be raised and said, well, isn't then human flourishing dependent on revelation on or faith? And consequently, isn't all what I want to say and what we as Christians could say to other human beings in pluralistic contexts, isn't that a no-brainer, or isn't that even relevant for those people? And then I try to show that if we look at Aquinas himself and his conception of the relation between revelation, faith and reason, revelation and human reason, it's interesting that he distinguishes between truth about God, which are not accessible to human reason and which therefore need to be revealed, and truth, which are accessible to human reason, but nevertheless also revealed. So, and for Aquinas, the doctrine of divine simplicity is precisely a truth of the second kind. So it is um, accessible to human reason and it is revealed. I haven't spoken here about where it is revealed. In Aquinas' views, it is revealed in the book of Exodus 3:14. But here I focused on the important part for the rebuttal of the objection, which is important to see that the doctrine of divine simplicity is a doctrine which pertains to so-called philosophical theology or natural theology. So we can give philosophical arguments which show us, which from the observation of created reality, which is accessible to our senses, and then we can reflect about what we can learn by our senses, by exercising our human reasons. We can learn that everything which is not God is metaphysically composed of that what it is and that it is. And if anything exists, or what exists, what we can observe with our senses, we can do a reasoning process and then recognize that there must exist a first cause, a creator, which is by nature simple. That means not composed in any way, and especially not composed of essence and esse, as everything which is not God. So there we can see, well, what I have to say and what we as Christians have to say is not only relevant for Christians, because it does not require to accept Christian faith or Christian revelation. We can enter in dialogue with everyone, with persons who have do not share our faith, or persons who are agnostic or atheist, and then present these kinds or other arguments, and so that in principle, everyone, every reasoning person should be able to acknowledge, to get to know these kinds of truths about God, about God's nature, which are relevant for human flourishing, in order not to have a wrong conception of creation and of God. Nonetheless, for Aquinas, this truth is also revealed, and that's probably the task and the purpose we as Christians have, to say, well, from our acceptance of the authority of the Bible and of our tradition, we can offer these kinds of philosophical arguments, but we have additional resources which can help us also to get things right by ourselves, to see if they cohere with what we believe, what we accept as revealed, and then discover mistakes which we ourselves as Christians, but maybe our fellow reasoners in pluralistic societies, errors they can make in thinking about their human happiness and their conceptions of God or the highest thing which exists. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I have come to the end of my first lecture. Just tomorrow we will look at again on Aquinas and see what can go wrong with views on the divine simplicity and how we can avoid making important mistakes about how we think about divine simplicity and what that implies. But I hope I was able to convey something about the idea, that you have a clearer idea about the question and answering the question, divine simplicity, why should we care about that? So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to entering into discussion with you and into yeah, answering your questions you might have. Thank you very much.